So for those of you who do not know, I actually grew up in the middle of nowhere. And I grew up in this little tiny town. There's 6,000 people. It's Dryden, Ontario. And it's north of Minnesota. So if you go north for about 3 hours, 2-3 hours, you'll get to my town that I grew up in. I like to say that we were 4 hours away, and it's true, we were 4 hours away from any university. So my story in terms of how I actually got to, first of all, at FSU and then ended up here is a little different. I think it's not traditional in the sense that you normally hear. These are my grandparents right here. They were fresh off the boat. This is literally the boat that they came on from Poland. They escaped in 1935. And one of the things they did, or the thing that they did, is they went to Canada to clear land. And so their job was to clear a plot of land. Right here, I don't know if you can see, this is actually my aunt doing that sexy Sally pose on top of all this wood that's up there. This is my family. This is who I am, and this is deeply part of who I actually am and how I identify. On my other side, this is my dad's side, these Polish immigrants. And on my other side, my mom's side, that's my grandpa right here. He actually lied to get into the Canadian military, and he went overseas, and he was there from 1939 onwards. Typical war hero stuff. Came back, so did the whole thing, went all the way through Europe. And then he came back and he raised a family of 7 kids in this little tiny house right here, which seems really small today. And my mom literally has the stories. She is the person that used to walk to school for 5 miles a day. I know because I know where that was. And she would walk to school for 5 miles a day in minus 30-degree weather. So it was, yes, Celsius, yeah, very, very cold. But she did that. That's my life. And you can imagine none of these folks were intellectual. So I was the first one in my family that actually went away to university. I'm very excited.
The house is still there, by the way?
Pardon?
The house is still there?
I believe so. I think I'm not sure if they actually tore it down or not. It's a few years old. But yeah, nobody's living in it now. They just were using it as storage. So I'm the first in my family to go away to university, and I was the youngest of my family to go away, or youngest of my family. And so going to university was a really, really big thing for me. And especially once you start understanding who I actually was. This is I was going through some of the things recently, and I found this. I was in special ed until I was in grade 5. So you can see the date, June 1988. So I was probably not the kid to go away. I wasn't even athletic at all. These shoes, I have them at home. When I was a kid, I actually had to wear these shoes to straighten out my legs. There were shoes that were nailed to a board. I don't know. I tell doctors today that this happened. They're like, what? They did what? Yes, they did that. These were the shoes that I had to wear.
Startup for selling these shoes these days. Good Lord.
Yeah, I know. I should. I should. And I distinctly remember walking out at night, because I had to wear them at night. I had to drag my feet behind me to go see my mom. And I distinctly remember that. So how did I actually get here? What's the story? Part of the story is that I began to think a little bit differently about myself. Right, so from the kid, and my mom has a funny story that when I was in elementary school, we used to have these foot races. So the school I went through was K-8 school, and we'd have these foot races in the school, and I was always the last one. So they'd be packing everything up, and I was the last one. And I remember this because they were cheering. Everybody in the entire school was cheering me on. and I was running up behind as they were packing everything up. So I went and I thought of myself often as a failure, as many of us do, right? As people that are behind or not that good. But when I was in high school, I learned how to study a little bit. And I went from having really terrible grades in elementary school to being some of the top grades in the entire high school. And so my last year, I studied really hard and I ended up getting into the University of Waterloo. And so Caitlin knows that that is a pretty good school in Canada for an engineering program. And one of the ways that we paid, or I paid for school, was through their co-op program, which is an internship program. I distinctly remember in high school having a major argument with my dad that I shouldn't go away to school because it cost too much money. And so I had to figure out how to actually do that. And the way that I did that was going to a school that had internships, and I also had scholarships. I earned my way through school. And one of the internships that I had to go to, by the way, this is the town that I grew up in. The internships that I had to go to, or I went to, were all about research and development and innovation and things like that. So I'm interested in that because part of the experience that I had was through these co-ops of learning what it means to be in innovation, in R&D. So I thought, after I did my undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, I thought I would go back and work at this mill. My dad worked there for 46 years as a pulp machine operator. So it was just my dad that was working in my family. My mom stayed at home to raise 6 kids. And my dad worked there, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna go get a degree in management science, and then I'll go, hopefully work as the high-fluting people at the mill. And I did. I went into management science, and did a management science. But after that, I was able to get a job in the Ministry of Health in Ontario, which is a large health organization. And I started to get exposed to things related to healthcare and understand about healthcare. And I was interested in thinking about innovation in healthcare. And one of the people that I actually had so one of my roommates that I had when I was in Calgary at one of these positions over here on co-op, he actually had a PhD. So I didn't know anybody that went away to university in my family or even in my hometown. Only teachers went away to university to get an education. So I met this guy that had a PhD, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. This person is kind of, he's kind of quirky, kind of nerdy like myself. So I'm gonna go and get a PhD. So I went to apply to different schools around Canada because that's what I knew, and I got into the Ivy Business School, and that's where I met Klaus and I met Mark Zabracki. And Juan Branzi and a number of great scholars that were there. But in my first year that I was there, so one of the things, and this is going to come up later on in the presentation, both my dad and my father-in-law both worked at, so I married my high school sweetheart from my hometown, and they both worked at this mill. And they both at the same time, when I started my PhD program, had terminal cancer. And it just so happened in December of that year of 2005, both of them passed away within a week of each other. So it was a little bit traumatic, to say the least. But one of the things that my dad said, I remember is one of the last things he ever said to me is why, and I'm not lying, he literally did say this, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And it got me to think about, what can I do? How can I change this? And then I worked really hard to learn about medical technology. Because one of the things I began to get exposed to and think about is that there's many innovations that happen in medical technology that can extend our lives or have better quality of life. And when I started investigating this, I started looking at medical device data. I found this really interesting situation of looking at how the first pacemakers were invented. And I don't know if any of you have heard the story of how, so the first pacemakers were actually started in Minnesota, Minneapolis, if you didn't know that. And it's Medtronic today is the big company that came from that. So Medtronic actually started out as a little garage company. And how they actually started is that there was these blue babies that were born. So he would have been called a blue baby. Has anybody ever heard of that term before? So a blue baby is when you're born and your heart is not pumping properly, your skin appears blue. Right, and they used to call them blue babies. It was a term back in the 1950s. And so the way that they would help these kids is they would literally strap car batteries onto their chest. And then they would hopefully pace their hearts through their chest. That was the first pacemakers. I want you to pay attention to something in 1 second. Oh, has this ever happened? I mean, I think so. It's part of the slide, by the way. So this happens to everybody, right? These experiences where things just don't work out, there's some sort of technical failure happens all of the time. It's part of our experiences that we go through. And not only
When was that, by the way, about the idea of attaching the battery to the?
1950s, early 1950s.
Really?
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Mhm.
Dr. Lillehei was the inventor, and Earl Bakken, I believe, is the innovator. The guy that actually had the garage. He worked for one of the hospitals in Minnesota, and he would go home and set up this little battery pack. And they had no FDA or anything like that before, right? They literally went home, got this battery pack and put it on the baby's chest the next day, like a battery on their chest.
So how did you explain why, where did the idea come from?
Well, Dr. Lillehei was doing cardiac surgery at the time, and so we understand a little bit about pacing. Like pacing the heart, making sure that the heart would pump. So
The heart to start a car that is stolen?
yeah, no, it is true. It's not. It's amazing when you read it. I got a quote in 1 second. You'll see just what they had to go through. So we actually define ourselves often. Not only do we define ourselves often as failures, or what I like to say is most of the time we define ourselves in sort of blah land, where it's neither failure or success. But we know, at least I know personally, and we can see in many of these technologies that actually get invented, that learning from failure actually matters. Right? Understand why is it that somebody in my situation why did I go? And why am I here? Versus somebody else that probably would have had the same experiences and chose not to do that. I know that learning was really important to me. So this is a quote from Earl Bakken, who is the inventor of the pacemaker, and this gives you an idea just how important failure actually is to the whole story, as Zura was pointing out. So I'm just going to read this quote so you can hear it. So 50 to 75 volts was intolerable. It takes that much to stimulate the heart through the chest. Remember, they did not, at the time, they were not doing, putting leads or the electrodes into their heart. What they're doing is strapping it on the outside of their chest. Getting a shock like that 50 to 60 times a minute is torture. With some of these infants, we're able to restrain them so they wouldn't tear off, but they would develop blisters and ulcers in 4 to 5 days. So I don't know about you, but if that was my kid up there, I would have been in tears the whole time. I couldn't have done that. And they were extending the lives of these kids just a little bit. Yes.
Professor, so, you can read this example as a failure or just an attempt to try out things when probably we didn't even anticipate some of the consequences of that.
Yeah.
In other words, I mean, however painful for the kid and however despicable in another respect, I think that I don't see that necessarily as a failure, correct? That could be true whenever you try to experiment with new therapies, correct? Like,
Yeah.
That could also be a necessary step to improve things, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. But what I'm sort of finding as failure is more of negative experiences that we go through. Right. So
So say that's a heart failure. It's a heart failure.
No, but you're not talking about heart failure, you're talking about how you try to treat certain medical conditions, correct?
Yeah.
Pathological situations, correct?
Yeah. But you still have to be, so if they would have thought about this and kind of the way that we conceive many of our experiences as being very successful, they probably wouldn't have done this, right? Because it seemed far too painful to do anything like that. It was a very negative experience. That we,
At Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan, they treat schizophrenic patients with hot and cold showers, one after the other. And were claiming that they could get rid of some symptoms.
I think they still, from what I heard, my brother-in-law is an ER doctor. He said that they actually still do the shock therapy for some patients, which is amazing that they actually still do that. But the bigger point of all of this is that learning from, whether you call it failure or not, these negative experiences actually are important to learn from, right? And we have to figure out how to not only learn from them and gather some inferences from them, but also to figure out how do we actually improve so that we don't experience those things in the future. Right, so I mostly study medical device innovation in adverse event data. So 510K and PMA data. And I mostly look at the adverse events or allegedly serious cause injuries or death that are due to products, medical products. But this could be applied to many areas. So when I was doing my PhD, there was two big things that were going on. So these are medical devices, from a Band-Aid to like an X-ray machine. There was one thing that was, there was a report that came out that showed that medical errors were really, really important. And lots of hospitals were doing medical errors. But when I was doing my PhD and reading about, I did it in strategy, general management strategy, but most of the stuff I read was about how successful we were. Right, and if you look at the strategy world, and even the innovation literature as well, yeah, we're we're really, really successful all the time. There's this great paper, I don't know if you've read it, The Organizational Performance as a Dependent Variable by Jim March and Bob Sutton. And it's essentially really teasing that apart and saying, hey, we should not be focusing on performance at all. There's all these other effects that are really, really important. So I had to figure out, okay, how do we go from this world of like, we're always so successful all the time, is what we teach in business school, to thinking about these moments where it doesn't work like that all of the time. And so you can see a lot of different examples where there are failures or negative experience, however you might define it, that result to innovation, and then it's an endogenous process as well, right? So the innovation sometimes results in failures as well. Anybody know what this ship is? So that's a railway accident. Anybody know what ship this is?
Titanic?
It's the Titanic. Why did so many people die in the Titanic? 1,500 people died in the Titanic. Not,
A series of failures.
okay, so what was the first thing?
They didn't design the water protection or something correctly.
That's right. The hulls were designed, and there's a lot of different ways. That actually, the hull was too brittle. Then we used very, very strong steel. It was too brittle to absorb the iceberg. The halls didn't have, they weren't completely closed off to the top. What else?
Overconfident, they
Oh.
were trying to get there as fast as they could and.
That's a great one. Overconfidence, absolutely. Any others?
Not enough lifeboats.
Not enough lifeboats. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, thank you. Not enough lifeboats. What do you think you should do if you're regulating the industry after that accident actually happens? Tell everybody to put more lifeboats on their boats, right? So 2 years later, there was a new act, a new regulation that was put in place. And they put more lifeboats on all the boats. Anybody know this boat? This is the SS Eastland in the port of Chicago. And they actually retrofitted this boat and they put a lot of lifeboats on there, enough for everybody. But it turned out it was top heavy. And it fell over. And 900 people died. Just about as many people as the Titanic.
When was that?
This was 2 years after the Titanic,
So
19.
there's Vasa, the Swedish boat that they put to fight the Poles, I think, or whatever. And the minute they finished it, they put it out and it fell on the.
It's a real thing, right? Like this does happen. It's hard to figure the dynamics, the physics of these things. And so even when you try to do something to prevent a massive failure, I hope, you know, that would count as a failure, right? Yeah, so a massive failure like or a negative experience like that, even when you do that, it's not always obvious what you should do. You have to make some really big inferences. It's not easy to understand. Right, you could see this in many different moments of life where we have these new innovations that are introduced. We're really excited about them, like Zeppelins, for example. We don't see Zeppelins anymore. That was real cutting edge back in the day, before the Hindenburg. This was a bridge in engineering school. Everybody uses this as their like engineering 101 example. This is the Tacoma Bridge, and the reason why they do that, there was a new bridge that was built. It was supposed to be really cool, except for they didn't account for resonance. So resonance is this thing that in the wind it would start to sway, and it started to sway and it started to sway, and so eventually it broke apart. And they have a video of it. It's really fascinating to watch. Another, you know, the classic example is nuclear, where this was cutting edge. Everybody was, I mean, it was a nuclear age. We defined our era by that innovation until we had all these accidents that we know of, like 3 Mile Island incident, which would have affected New York, by the way. It would have made New York inhabitable if that was a meltdown. Bhopal is another great example. The Challenger disaster. We defined ourselves as a nation and as a world by NASA. NASA was the most innovative agency until we started having these accidents. Freddie Mac, right? The reason why we had the financial disaster was because of new financial instruments that were being introduced. We didn't understand the consequences. That's the Fukushima disaster as well, and that's the Deepwater Horizon. So my research really is focused on making innovation or making inferences from failure, but also thinking about how do we actually innovate from them, right? So I'm kind of loosely in that area of entrepreneurship and strategic management of technology. But it's really thinking about how do we make sense of these negative experiences that we have. I want to tell you about one thing. I apologize, you can't see this very well. I'm building a academic startup that I'm really excited about, and I've been doing this for some time. It's a little weird. It's called the R3ciprocity project. And by the way, I also organize a conference on organizational learning if any of you want to attend. So this academic startup or this startup idea, I know it's not necessarily research oriented, but I'll get there in a minute. I want to work on something that was close at home. So when I was in my 3rd year of my assistant professor position at FSU, I went to Disney. Disney's really close to FSU. And it's about a 4-hour drive from there. My wife had a conference. I went there, took my kids, and I was driving home and I was doing mind wandering exercise, right? You know how your mind just kind of wanders. When I was driving back, I had this epiphany of why is doing research, why is it so hard? Right? Why do we all feel like we have to struggle at doing research all the time? And so I started thinking about this is if you start looking at the process of doing research, there's lots of sort of negative things that happen to it. We get a lot of negative feedback all the time. Often there's a lack of feedback. And it's very demotivating. Ask any PhD, look at anything on the internet about PhD students, and it's always just these like really negative memes, right? So I started thinking there has to be a better way to doing this. There's gotta be a better way. So I started thinking about this as a design problem and doing research, like actually the act of doing research as a design problem. Right, so one way to think of it is kind of we're moving up and sort of getting to the top of the world and climbing this mountain, but another way to think about it is, what if we designed a system where anybody at any skill level can be able to create non-rejectable research? What would that actually look like? Right, and so that's where I began to build the R3ciprocity platform. And I've been building this for many years now. I think it's like 8 or 9 years I've actually been building this. Not too many people know about it. I try to be as open on the internet as possible. That's where I wanted to actually have this, put this on the internet. And it's the idea of how do we actually democratize the production of research as we know it? What might that actually look like? Right, so to me, it would be a fun, kind of silly, goofy experience, but also very, very inspiring. That you'll want to get back up and do it again, right? I tried to build a community. I tried to actually build this thing at my institution. It totally fell apart. It did doing the sort of startup thing and know that Melissa's there. It's a little challenging to do it. And so when it didn't work, I ended up I convinced my wife to spend a whole bunch of money in a contract developer. And we built this thing. There's a contract developer in the Ukraine. I put it on the internet and I was really excited. And I put it on Facebook and I thought everybody would be really excited about it. And I got about 5 likes. And I thought, oh, now what do I do? And so what I did is I had to start building community. And so a lot of it's about thinking about the process and how to inspire more people to become researchers. And so going in at the moments where we feel the most darkest and coaching people through to get to the other side, as well as building this particular platform. So I've been building it for a long time, and it continues to grow, and it continues to do better. But one of the things that I've noticed when I've been doing this is that there's a persistent theme. So I look at the content. I'm all over the internet now. You can probably see me on the internet, and I look at the content that does really well. And it's typically based on the same story where we define ourselves for the expectation of success, and we don't get there. And most of us actually live in the land of failure, where we feel that we're not good enough, we shouldn't be here. I feel, I was like, I'm gonna be presenting at NYU and I'm gonna tell my mom that she's never gonna believe me. Right, here's this silly little kid from Northern Ontario is presenting at NYU. That's a crazy moment in my life. So most of us live in this experience over here, which is totally different than how we define and think about it in much of the literature.